Welcome to Security Highlights. My name is Nathanael. I manage the cybersecurity for DornerWorks. Today we're going to discuss a few stories in the news regarding cybersecurity on IoT device development and offer a commentary on how some of these situations could have been avoided. We have some special guests that are with us. Ray Smith is an embedded software engineer. Michael Spoehr is a cloud solutions engineer. We also have Greg Nowak, a technology strategy leader for the IoT team. Welcome, Ray, Michael, Greg. So we hear a lot about IoT connected devices in the news. One of the most popular stories is probably the one in 2015 when a couple hackers took control of a Jeep Cherokee. How did this happen? It seems quite amazing how they were able to control the Jeep. I watched the video. Ray, you want to fill us in?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the automotive industry has a set process for building cars, but back in 2015, that process didn't really include much consideration for the implications of connecting a car and making it an IoT device. In addition, there's always this push to add new features, and these new features often require connectivity. You think about your GPS or adding a Wi-Fi hotspot for the kids to stream in the backseat of a car. All of those things require connectivity. Add to that, these security researchers had physical access to the Jeep. They were able to spend time and find a really obscure bug in how the car used its cellular modem and then gain access to the entertainment system in that car. Now, I don't know how familiar everybody is with their cars, but cars have tens of computer devices controlling various aspects of the car. And those computer devices communicate on a network that's called the CAN bus. That CAN bus basically has access to just about everything that's there. So these researchers were able to gain access to that entertainment system, and that entertainment system was on the CAN bus, and they were able to then filter their way through and figure out what messages were being sent, modify those messages, and then send directed messages to those other systems in the car, thinking your steering, your windshield wipers, your brakes, things like that. They were able to send messages to those devices across the car.
Wow, so how did that design happen? Were they just not thinking of the device security, as Greg mentioned last episode?
So cars have been mandated to use something like the CAN bus since the early 90s to enable better efficiency in their cars. And that bus ended up being used for more and more things as cars got more and more technologically advanced. Again, since connectivity is a relatively new thing to cars, it just was an afterthought.
I imagine too, as we add these self-driving cars, that'll be a whole nother thing we'll have to think about in IoT space.
Interestingly about that, so companies like Tesla, they tend to have a little bit more thought put into it. I've worked with a few Tesla cars in the past, and they have over-the-air updates and things like that baked in. They're essentially running full Linux computers in a lot of cases. Some of that may change over time, but they're essentially locking down things from the very beginning instead of thinking about things in a piecemeal situation.
So it's really important to keep thinking that security mindset even at the outstart with some of these cars and other devices.
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, thank you. Another story that is ongoing is our increasing number of connected devices in our homes. Even our dishwashers are connected to the internet. Do you guys have some tips for users on making sure their devices are secure? I know for me, I've got all kinds of devices and I'm always wondering, how do I secure them?
So the most important thing you can do is attempt to minimize your attack surface. Ray had mentioned in the last episode about securing your devices from your home network and securing your home network from the devices. It can always be a little bit of a concern when you're adding a new device to your home network about what kind of resources on your network would that device be able to access. You have your work computer on the same network as an IoT device. Is that IoT device able to inadvertently access resources that you wouldn't want it to be able to access? So those are the kinds of things that, from a general perspective, as a user, you should try to look at attempting to assume the worst, I guess, and apply security to your network itself. So one common practice is to isolate those IoT devices in your home to their own network that they only have the ability to access the internet. They wouldn't have the ability to talk to each other, and most importantly, they wouldn't have the ability to communicate with other devices on your network, like your computers or your phones or things like that. Another aspect of this is because these devices are in our homes, the kind of data and information that they can collect about us is kind of inherently extremely personal. If you have a microphone or a video camera pointed at you all day in your own home, it may record some things that you wouldn't want other people to see. And so making sure these devices are following security best practices and are following regulatory and compliance requirements is very important. I'm reminded of a story I saw a few years ago about a particular brand of baby monitor, and we're going to talk more about baby monitors. But one of the things that they had done is that the camera would record the room and then upload that video to their cloud system, and they didn't secure the access to that video in a way that only the videos that your camera recorded could be accessed by you. So if you knew the ID of a different camera that someone owned, you could just type that ID in and it would pull up that camera's video, essentially allowing you to spy on anyone's house and just watch them. Unfortunately, another mistake that this company made was that they made their IDs auto-incrementing. So, they started at 1 and then the next device is 2. And so if you had camera 53, you knew that there's 52 other cameras before you, and so you could just input those IDs and just watch the videos of all those cameras. The way you can avoid that is to use a random ID. So one common way to do that is to use something like a GUID, where it's just a long string of characters that's randomly generated. And so even if that same company still had their video publicly exposed, which they definitely should not have done, but even if they did, if the IDs were completely random, that minimizes the attack surface and people wouldn't have been able to as easily guess the IDs and get access.
So you almost have to think kind of like a hacker. How would I gain access to this? You think about IoT security and building it into the system.
That is a very valuable practice as you're designing your devices, to kind of put on your bad actor hat and pretend that if I was trying to get into this, or if I had access to this, what kind of damage could I do, and then go from there to attempt to reduce the damage and secure your device in that way.
So a lot of these IoT devices have like online accounts I can log in and see what my thermostat or what the temperature of my house is. What are some ways to secure those accounts as well?
Yeah, so like I said in the last episode, most important thing is to ensure the least privilege. So make sure that all that information is securely stored. If it's sensitive information, you wouldn't want everyone at your company being able to access it. Certainly as a user, I wouldn't feel comfortable if I purchased an IoT device and I knew that the hundreds of employees at that company are able to just see all my personal information. But also to ensure that information is secured against attack from malicious actors. So when we talk about online accounts, one of the most important things is to have a secure password, or if it's an option, enable multi-factor authentication. So if the provider for your IoT device has an option for multi-factor authentication, make sure to enable it. Make sure that when you sign up for an account that you're using a unique password that is not used on any other site. That is the biggest mistake you can make, is if you reuse passwords from site to site. If a different site got hacked and your password is compromised, now an attacker can use that password that you've now reused on every other site. So if you used unique passwords per service or website, then any security events or incidents are isolated to those sites. And when you're making a password, remembering and using passwords is very difficult for users. So we often tend to think about like random passwords being more secure. Like if it has 12 characters and has a number and a symbol and an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter, people tend to think that those are more secure. But in fact, a much longer password, if it was easy to remember, and as long as you've used it only on that site, tends to be more secure.
So kind of like a passphrase more than a password.
Exactly, yeah. You can come up with a full sentence that's easy to remember, and it's maybe 60 characters. That's going to be much more secure than your 12-character random password.
Oh, that's really helpful. Another story that I thought was really interesting was a recent issue with the Apple AirTags, the Find My Device system people use to help find missing Apple devices. Can you guys explain what happened and how users were able to find a vulnerability in this system?
Yeah, I can take that. So to understand the vulnerability, we first kind of have to understand how they work in general. So the Apple AirTag and other tracking devices like that, they need to be low powered. So people can put them on anything. They can put them in their backpacks or on laptops or whatever it is. But in order for that device to be useful to everybody, it can't have its own cellular connection. It can't have its own big battery that you're going to charge all the time. Nobody would buy it. So the way that these tracking devices work is they are very low power beacons, essentially. And they beacon out some code. And the only reason that these tracking systems work is because you have a network of users with phones that happen to be scanning for these beacons. The Apple AirTag, for example, how many people own iPhones? Quite a few people. So if all of the iPhones out there are constantly scanning for these IDs, then they can associate a tag ID with the current location. And basically they're piggybacking on the internet connection and the battery of the phone in order to create a pretty big network of trackable devices. The way that these work is, like I said, they beacon out this ID, and in order to have an Apple AirTag compliant device, it has to satisfy certain criteria for what it's beaconing out. But the problem with this is that people can create devices that are not actually Apple AirTag devices, but they look like Apple AirTag devices. And the useful aspect of these tracking devices is that I can put it in my backpack and I can track where my backpack is. But another problem is somebody else can put a tag in my backpack and then track where my backpack is. Or they can put it on my car and then they know where my car is. And so in order to combat that, Apple is trying to figure out a way to track or limit some of these Apple AirTags that are not actually Apple AirTags. So one of the solutions that they proposed was, if you have some Apple AirTag that is beaconing, that is following a valid iPhone, then I can identify that as something that shouldn't be there because it's not associated with the person, but for some reason it always follows that person. And that was one of the security proposed fixes to the somebody else is trying to track me problem that comes up with these devices. And the security researcher in this particular case said, well, okay, I'm just going to create my own AirTag that beacons out a random to most people ID and changes the ID every time it beacons out. And then from the Apple's perspective, it looks like there are thousands of Apple AirTags near this person, but not a single AirTag that is following that person. But if you understand what the IDs are going to be, then the hacker, in this particular case, the person trying to track you, can, if they know what the sequence of IDs are, then it doesn't really help. So Apple is still trying to figure out a way to still have the AirTags be useful and still have them satisfy their ease of use, but also get around some of the very real security concerns that anybody can put these on anything and track people who don't want to be tracked.
Yeah, really privacy issues there too.
Absolutely. And for them to be useful, they need to be easy to use. They need to be low power, they need to be all these things, but that simplicity also means that they are easy to exploit.
It seems like a common theme is a lot of these older legacy devices. Do you guys see that? A lot of legacy systems come onto the internet and all of a sudden there's a bunch of updates that need to be applied or vulnerabilities taken care of. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I think that the time that you know the least about your product is as soon as it's released, and then you learn more and more and more as time goes on, and any vulnerability that is found is a potential attack surface that you need to deal with after the fact. So things that have been in the field for 5 years or something like that, chances are there have been vulnerabilities found in those past 5 years. So the first time you power it on, if it has the ability to download over-the-air updates, there will probably be an update needed. And what we were talking about before, where Tesla versus some of the other car manufacturers, Tesla started in the age of internet connectivity, where other car manufacturers started before the age of internet connectivity. So Tesla is able to build that update capability from the very beginning. It's not an afterthought because they don't have to deal with legacy systems. They are creating their systems today. So they are able to just build in, it's not a, oh, how do I support updating this? That's from the very beginning. They just built it in. It's not an add-on after the fact. So.
One of the things that we've had to deal with some customers is customers who sell devices that are internet connected and have OTA updates. So if there is a vulnerability that's found, an update can be created and pushed out to the devices. But what if there's many devices that are out there that are simply just not connected to the internet? Or what if they sit on a shelf for 3 years and then finally they come online? How do you handle getting those devices updated and ensuring that, that they can't do anything once they do finally come online? So it really is a matter of trying to not only create the update for the device itself, but updating your cloud infrastructure to minimize any potential impact, or to add special cases for handling those particular devices or update events. Yeah, when we talk about legacy systems, there can be just kind of the legacy of things that were manufactured but never sold or never powered on until a much later time, and so that's another consideration.
That's a good term, the legacy of things.
Yeah. I just came up with that on the spot.
Wow, that's great. I love it. Yeah, it's the legacy of IoT systems and figuring out. I know I have an IoT device. I haven't turned it on in 2 or 3 years. And I was thinking, hey, how am I going to update this, and what security vulnerabilities might be there? So yeah, that's really relevant. Another recent DNS vulnerability with IoT devices was the UC libc-ng vulnerability, where people were able to do DNS transaction IDs that potentially led to DNS poisoning. Anybody have any thoughts on what happened there?
I can summarize what the problem was. So this is a very well-known library, or very, very well-used library, and the vulnerability has been around for, I think it said, 10 years or so. And the vulnerability really falls back to using auto-incrementing transaction IDs. So similar to what we were talking about with the baby monitor, where the problem with the request is when the DNS lookup was requested, the response was always one ID ahead of the request. So the responder would always know exactly what to respond as far as a transaction ID. And on the embedded target, it would say, okay, well, my request ID is 5. I'm going to expect a response with request ID 6. From a hacker's perspective, I can intercept that and respond, and you would think that it's a valid response. So if I am trying to get the IP address of my destination, I'm going to pass it my URL, which is what the purpose of a DNS is. But if somebody on the other end is a bad guy, they could pass me back an IP address that is their IP address, not the IP address that I was actually trying to find. And when that happens, that means that all of my data that I think I'm sending to my cool website is actually going to their cool website. And that, for obvious reasons, is problematic, because now I trust them, and I am going to be communicating with their server rather than the intended server. So the reason that this is a bug is because the fact that the response ID is auto-incrementing means that it's very easy to guess what the response needs to be, where if you were following some algorithm that based on this input, you're going to get some, what would be a random output would be a lot better as far as stopping somebody from being able to guess. Because there's a certain timing to the response as well, is that the bad actor would need to respond before the legitimate response gets there. So it's not one of these vulnerabilities that is going to be easy, quote unquote, to exploit, because there is still a very timing dependent response, but it is something that is well within the means of people with resources to fake the response.
Great. Lots of great, amazing knowledge that I've really learned from this already. Any final thoughts as we close out this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could add on sort of a final thought, it would be that some of these things we've talked about are definitely vulnerabilities that you want to protect yourself from. But one of the great things about implementing security well is that by layering different types of security at all different points, you end up increasing the chance that you still won't fall vulnerable if someone is a bad actor exploiting one particular thing. For instance, the DNS bug that Greg just talked about, if your device is implementing a strong TLS encrypted connection using the latest version of TLS, so on 1.3, and you're verifying the certificate from the website you're trying to access, then you can still know if someone jumps in and tries to impersonate the website you're trying to go to, because they won't have the proper certificate with the proper key. All that to say, layering all of your bits of security together ends up making for a much stronger position for you. And that's something that is definitely helpful when designing IoT systems and their backends.
Coming back to the same theme, building it in at all levels. That's great. Well, thanks, Ray, Greg, Michael, for coming out today. It's really important to choose a partner that understands and knows how to protect your data in IoT systems. Our IoT team is working hard and has such great knowledge, as we learned about today, every day to build IoT devices, networks that are cyber safe. For now, stay cyber safe.